Welcome to Shadows and Gods, where ancient myths rise from the darkness and legendary worlds come alive. Today we peel open a legend few truly understand, a tale whispered across millennia, a story not just of warriors and kings, but of the emotions they feared most and dared to master. This is the truth behind Sparta's darkest mystery. Why the world's most formidable soldiers confronted fear not by denying it, but by giving it form, ritual, and power. The Spartan warrior. For millennia, that name alone has conjured an image of the perfect soldier. Disciplined, unflinching, and supposedly without fear. We picture them as living weapons, forged in a brutal system that beat all emotion out of them, leaving only a cold, lethal resolve. They were the masters of battle, the unbreachable shield wall of ancient Greece. But what if the secret to their legendary fearlessness wasn't the absence of fear, but its constant, ritualized presence? Popular legend tells a story almost too perfect to be true, that the Spartans, the most hardened warriors in history, actually built temples to fear itself. The story goes that in the heart of their society, they prayed to Phobos, the divine personification of terror, the very emotion they sought to master on the battlefield. It's a chilling idea. To conquer fear, you must first make it a god. But the truth is far stranger, more complex, and tells us so much more about who the Spartans really were. To understand their unique and brutal faith, we have to tear down the myths. And when we do, we find that the Spartans didn't just deify one emotion. They built a society around the ritual control of many, from terror and panic to death, and even laughter. This is the story of how Sparta's strange religion shaped its people, and why they didn't just fight their demons. They invited them in. The story usually starts with a single, tantalizing claim. The Roman-era writer Plutarch, writing centuries after Sparta's golden age, mentions that the Spartans had a shrine to fear, or Phobos, right beside the mess hall of their powerful magistrates, the ephors. It's a powerful image, suggesting that even at their daily meals, Sparta's leaders were reminded of fear's power. From this one mention, a legend grew. The idea of a formal state cult, where warriors prayed for courage by venerating its opposite. It's an idea that has captivated historians and storytellers for centuries. The logic feels perfect. To become immune to terror, a soldier has to confront it daily, understand it, and maybe even pay it respect as a primal force of nature. In this view, a temple to fear would have been the ultimate psychological tool, a way of domesticating the beast that breaks armies. Just one problem. Beyond Plutarch's account, there's virtually no archaeological evidence for a state-sponsored temple to Phobos. While many other Spartan religious sites have been uncovered, a temple dedicated to fear remains a ghost. This forces us to ask what authors like Plutarch were really doing. Writing in the Roman period, he was often more of a moral philosopher than a pure historian, using tales from Sparta's past to illustrate virtues and ideas. His claim about a temple might have referred to a small private shrine, an allegorical statue, or it may have just been his way of explaining the Spartan mindset. He notes that Spartans believed fear, when respected, was a positive force that held the state together. So, while a grand temple is likely a myth, the core idea that Spartans had a unique and deliberate relationship with fear is very real. They didn't worship fear in the way Athens worshipped Athena, asking for wisdom. Instead, they seem to have ritualized it. We know that before a battle, a Spartan commander might make a sacrifice to Phobos. This wasn't an act of devotion. It was an act of control. It was a way to acknowledge fear's power, confront it in a controlled setting, and psychologically prepare the army against the panic that could shatter a phalanx. It was about mastering an internal enemy before you ever faced the external one. So, if the famous Temple of Fear is a legend built on a whisper, What did the Spartans truly believe? To find the heart of their faith, we have to look past the obvious gods you'd expect a warrior state to worship. And what we find is a pantheon that is uniquely and brutally Spartan. If you were designing a religion for a society obsessed with war, you'd almost certainly put the god of war at its center. You would expect Sparta, the most militarized state in Greek history, to be the epicenter of the cult of Ares. You'd imagine grand temples in his name, his statue on the Acropolis, and his festival as the most important day on the calendar. And you'd be completely wrong. In one of the greatest paradoxes of ancient religion, Ares, the embodiment of war, slaughter, and bloodlust, was a surprisingly minor figure in Sparta. While he was acknowledged, he was far from their patron deity. In fact, ancient writers like Pausanias describe a Sparta dotted with shrines and temples to other gods, like Athena, who were clearly more central to their civic life than Ares. Their most important religious festivals, the Carneia and Hyacinthia, were dedicated to Apollo, not the god of war. Why would the ultimate warriors sideline the ultimate god of war? Because Ares represented everything, Spartan warfare was not. Homer describes Ares as a chaotic, brutal, and often cowardly force, a god who reveled in pure, indiscriminate violence. His sons were Phobos, fear, and Deimos, panic, the very spirits that cause an army to break and run. Spartan warfare, on the other hand, was the opposite of chaos. It was built on order, discipline, and the collective strength of the phalanx. The ideal Spartan warrior wasn't a raging berserker, but a calm, steady part of a larger machine. He fought with controlled courage, not frenzied bloodlust. To the Spartans, Ares was the failure of discipline. The moment strategy dissolves into a brawl, honoring him as a primary deity would have been a complete contradiction of their military philosophy. In a fascinating twist, the one notable shrine to a war god in Sparta that Pausanias mentions depicted the deity Enyalius, often identified with Ares, in chains. Pausanias explains that the Spartans believed that by chaining the god of war, the spirit of war and victory could never desert their city. It's a perfect metaphor for their attitude. War, like a dangerous beast, had to be kept on a leash, controlled and contained, never allowed to run wild. Other gods were also conspicuously downplayed. Hephaestus, the god of the forge and invention, had little place in a society that famously disdained luxury and material wealth. Sparta's focus was on perfecting the human body as a weapon, not on creating elaborate goods. By seeing who the Spartans chose not to worship, we get a clearer picture of their values. Their religion wasn't a celebration of war itself, but a carefully constructed system designed to produce the ideal warrior. And at the heart of that system wasn't a male god of battle, but a terrifying ancient goddess who oversaw the very creation of the Spartan soul. Deep in a floodplain by the banks of the Eurotas River, archaeologists uncovered the true center of Spartan religious life. It wasn't a temple to a mighty Olympian, but the sanctuary of a far older, stranger, and more brutal deity, Artemis Orthia. While Athens had its gleaming Parthenon for Athena, Sparta's spiritual core was here, at a site used for over 1,000 years. This was not the Artemis known in the rest of Greece. The virgin huntress and Apollo's twin. The Spartan goddess was a fusion of the Olympian Artemis with a much older, local goddess named Orthia. Her domain was primal and deeply connected to the Spartan way of life. She was a goddess of wild places and a kuratrophos, a protector and nurturer of the youth. Her sacred duty was to oversee the transformation of Spartan children into hardened citizens. She was the divine matron of the Agoge, Sparta's infamous state-sponsored training program, and the rituals performed in her name were as brutal as the society she served. The most famous of these, which became a notorious spectacle in the Roman era, was the diamastigosis, or the ritual of scourging. Imagine the scene. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, Spartan youths would gather. Cheeses would be stacked on the altar, and the boys would have to try to steal them, while older men guarded the altar with whips. As the boys rushed forward, the whips rained down. The goal wasn't to avoid the whips, but to endure them without crying out, to show the Spartan virtue of endurance. Pausanias tells us the priestess of the cult stood by, holding a small ancient wooden statue of the goddess. He claims the statue, normally light, would grow inexplicably heavy in her hands if the whip bearers didn't strike with enough force, as if the goddess herself demanded a greater offering of pain. For the boys, this was a rite of passage, a public performance of their worthiness, and a blood sacrifice to the goddess who presided over their transition to manhood. While this spectacle is documented by later Roman-era writers, it likely evolved from even earlier, harsher initiation rites fundamental to Spartan identity. The sheer importance of Artemis Orthia is proven by what was found buried in her sanctuary. Over 100,000 small personal votive offerings. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of tiny lead figurines of warriors and animals, alongside a vast number of terracotta masks representing everything from old women to fierce hoplites. These weren't grand statues, but tokens of a deep, personal connection between the people and their goddess. The cult of Artemis Orthia was the religious engine of the Spartan state. It was here, through ritualized pain and endurance, that children were forged into Spartans, their blood staining the altar of the goddess who demanded strength above all else. While Artemis Orthia shaped the Spartan from the inside out, another cult protected them on the battlefield. Known throughout Greece but revered with a special intensity in Sparta, the Dioscuri, the divine twins Castor and Pollux, were the patron gods of the Spartan warrior. Their story was deeply woven into Sparta's identity. In mythology, they were Spartan princes themselves, the twin brothers of Helen of Troy. One brother, Castor, was the mortal son of the Spartan king Tyndareus, while Pollux was the immortal son of the god Zeus. When the mortal Castor was killed in battle, Pollux pleaded with Zeus to let him share his immortality with his brother. So they came to split their time between the underworld and Olympus, forever united. For the Spartans, the Dioscuri were the divine embodiment of their most cherished military ideals. As twins, they represented the unbreakable brotherhood, essential to the phalanx, where every man's life depended on the man beside him. They were patrons of horsemanship and athletics, embodying the physical prowess every Spartan aspired to. Most importantly, they were seen as protectors in battle. The Spartans believed the Dioscuri would physically appear on the battlefield to aid their armies. Their unique dual kingship, with two kings ruling simultaneously, was even seen as a human reflection of the divine twins. When the army marched to war, one king would lead them, accompanied by a symbolic representation of one of the twins, while the other king and twin remained to protect Sparta. Before battle, soldiers would offer prayers and sacrifices to Castor and Pollux. Their worship wasn't about invoking rage, but about calling upon divine models of brotherhood and loyalty. The Dioscuri weren't distant gods. They were brothers in arms, the ultimate Spartan warriors who had ascended to divinity. So we return to where we began, the specter of fear. If there was no grand temple, does that mean the Spartans simply ignored Phobos? Far from it. They just approached these dark spirits in a way that was uniquely practical and psychological. They didn't worship them, they managed them. According to later writers like Plutarch, the Spartans established small shrines or cults, not just to Phobos, fear, but also to Thanatos, death, and, most surprisingly, Gelos, laughter. Reverence for Phobos and Thanatos wasn't about glorifying terror or death. It was an exercise in psychological mastery. By giving these forces a name, a place, and a ritual, the Spartans were stripping them of their unknown, chaotic power. It was an act of what anthropologists call apotropaic magic, rituals designed to ward off a dangerous influence. A soldier preparing for battle confronts death and fear every time. By making a small sacrifice at a shrine to Phobos or Thanatos, he wasn't asking them to visit him. He was acknowledging their reality, facing them on his own terms, and placing them under a kind of divine supervision before they could overwhelm him in combat. Perhaps the most humanizing and unexpected of these cults was the one dedicated to Gelos, the spirit of laughter. Plutarch, citing the much earlier historian Sosibius, claims that the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus himself dedicated a small statue to laughter. In a society as famously rigid and severe as Sparta, a place for ritualized laughter seems completely out of character. But it was likely a crucial social release valve. Spartan life was one of relentless discipline and public scrutiny. Having a formal, accepted space for laughter, likely during communal meals, would have been essential for social cohesion. It provided a sanctioned outlet for tension, strengthened bonds between soldiers, and offered relief from the crushing seriousness of their lives. The deification of Gelos suggests a sophisticated understanding of social psychology. The Spartans recognized that laughter, like fear, was a powerful force that could be disruptive if left uncontrolled, but incredibly valuable if harnessed for the good of the community. We began with a simple, chilling myth: warriors who built a temple to fear itself. But as we've peeled back the layers of legend, we've found a reality that is infinitely more complex and awe-inspiring. The true religion of Sparta was a finely tuned social technology, an operating system for producing the most formidable citizens the ancient world had ever seen. Their gods weren't distant figures on Olympus, but active partners in the creation of their society. They largely ignored Ares, the god of chaotic war, because their system was built on discipline. Instead, they centered their faith on Artemis Orthia, a brutal goddess whose initiation rites forged children into unflinching adults. They venerated the Dioscuri, the divine twins who served as a celestial model for the unbreakable brotherhood of the phalanx. And finally, they turned to the dark spirits of the human psyche. They didn't build a temple to worship fear, but they acknowledged its power through ritual, domesticating it into a tool for social control. They even made a place for laughter, recognizing its power to bind a community that lived constantly on the edge. In the end, the Spartans were not fearless because they banished fear, but because they faced it head-on, shaping it through ritual, discipline, and devotion until it became something they could wield rather than flee from. Their gods mirrored their world, harsh, demanding, unyielding. Through them, the Spartans carved a society unlike any other, one where courage was crafted, not inherited, and where even the darkest forces of the human soul could be mastered. Their legacy reminds us that fear is not the enemy. It is the crucible through which strength is born.